Okay, well, we'll make a start. Welcome to everyone who's already logged on. I'm sure there'll be other people joining us. And welcome to our webinar on the impact of the environment on learning. We've had plenty of interest prior to today, people registering. So obviously it's a topic that has really resonated with people and something that, from the questions those of you have posed beforehand, something that people are interested in exploring further. It's also worth pointing out that for the avoidance of any doubt, the irony is not lost on us that this discussion of the impact of the natural environment on learning is being held in a virtual space. But hopefully the content of what we're going to discuss will be more relevant. And also just to give you an idea of where people are, so I'm here in our office in Birmingham, Ruth Moody's in Bristol, and guest Pedro is in the Nielsen offices in Geneva. So to give you an idea of the environments that we're all in before we start the presentation. Just to introduce the three of us, so I'm Neil Kimberley, I'm the Commercial Director here at Farscape. Ruth, who's going to be leading most of the presentation, is our Managing Director. And Ruth and I have worked together for a long time and have a real passion about the outdoors and the role of the environment in learning. And it's something that we've explored here at Farscape for some time now. And our most recent leadership experience in Morocco that Ruth and Pedro are going to discuss is, I guess, the sort of culmination of all our research and reading on the topic. And hopefully their conversation as they go through the webinar will give you more insights into how you can build that into your learning and design for the organisations that you're part of. Our guest with us today is Pedro Lima. As you can see on the screen, he's the Head of Business Development for Nielsen. Nielsen are a global consumer and media insights company. And Pedro was very able to join us on our experience in Morocco as one of the delegates. And so we've invited him along today to share some of his insights and thoughts and experiences of the time that he had with us while we're on our trek in Morocco. Okay, Ruth, if that's all there, I'll hand over to you. And then...
Fantastic, thanks, Neil. So just on the screen here, just to give you an idea of what we're going to be covering today during the webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about the background to the Morocco expedition and also just share with you some of the science behind why we chose to take people on an expedition for their leadership development. So that's going to involve a discussion around the impact of the environment with Pedro, and also touching upon reflective learning, because what we've learned is that the environment is really helpful in allowing people to start to reflect and think more deeply about some of the leadership challenges that they may face. And one of the results of being in that kind of environment where reflection is taking place is also a greater openness, vulnerability, and an opportunity to really think about resilience. So we're going to be talking about those different aspects of environment as we go through the webinar. And then, of course, talking about the business impact, because it's all well and good being imaginative about the environments that we operate in, but it does need to deliver business results. So to start off with then, some background about Morocco and why we chose to go there. As Neil has touched upon already, we are really passionate about the outdoors and how the outdoors can be used for people's learning. But I think something that we've noticed in our years of working in this environment is that there's a lot of perceptions around the outdoors as being a let's get muddy for the sake of it type of environment, where people may have a great time, but actually any kind of learning is implicit, or the delegates themselves are left to join up the dots. And so for us, we've been on a journey over the last few years of looking at how we can create environments, indoors and outdoors, which really are inspirational, which allow people space and time to reflect, and also are going to aid and enhance the learning, rather than working against it, which sometimes the environment can do. So in our experience of working with business leaders, one of the key messages that we get from them is that they just don't have the space or time to reflect. And that trying to do that reflection at the office isn't always that easy, because it's really difficult for people to disconnect when they're at work. So our experience shows that by taking people away from the office into a space where they can disconnect is really powerful for them. But actually, what's the business imperative for this? How can leaders demonstrate the value to the business in taking part in this kind of experience so that they do have the opportunity to step away and to disconnect? So in terms of our backgrounds, both Neil and I have led a number of expeditions over the years and have seen the transformation that people go on during that journey, purely from being away from all of the kind of normal distractions, challenges and issues that they may be facing at work. And that, alongside some research that Neil's been doing as part of his master's around coaching and the importance of environment when coaching, has really got us to a place of wanting to look more deeply at whether taking leaders into a different kind of environment can really help to enhance their leadership development. There's a lot of science and research that sits behind all of this, and I just wanted to share a couple of bits with you today before we then go on to hear from Pedro about his experiences. One of the areas that we have built into our programs a lot is around attention and the different kinds of attention that people have. So there are two types of attention, the first of which is involuntary attention, which is where people's attention is captured by, as you can see on the slide there, by intriguing or important stimuli. So a good example of that would be when a car beeps its horn as you're crossing the road, just to let you know that you're about to get run over. It's not a good kind of attention grabbing situation, but it does grab your attention, and then you have to take some decisions to avoid being hit. The other side is the side that we use more often at work, which is about directed attention, where we have to direct our attention using cognitive control processes. So there's research to show that actually we can go into environments. I'm going to flash at the next slide here. We can go into environments which are gentle, which have got inherently fascinating things going on, which allow that involuntary attention part of the brain to be stimulated so that the directed attention side of the brain can rest and replenish. And actually, when people go into natural environments and have that opportunity to really switch off that directed attention side of the brain, they are then much more able, when they come back to work and need to use that directed attention side of the brain, to function more effectively, to be more productive and effective. So for those of us who did well at school, you know, people who were able to retain lots of information, to concentrate for long periods of time, to be focused on fiddly tasks, you tend to be the people who are good at that directed attention side of things. But we all need to be able to give that side of our brain a chance to rest and recuperate, and going into the natural environment is something that will allow us to do that. And that's called something attention restoration theory, which is by a guy called Stephen Kaplan, or the research was led by a guy called Stephen Kaplan. It's a really interesting topic and something that really formed the basis for us of the expedition to Morocco. So before we go on to hear from Pedro about the impact of the environment for him as a delegate on this kind of experience, we're going to run our first poll. So Neil, can I pass over to you to set that up?
Yeah, so hopefully people should be able to see on the screen now the questions. So just interested to see where the majority of physical training actually takes place in your organisation. So if you can each click one of the radio buttons, and I'll just track where we're up to. A few more people needing to vote to get us as close to the 100% as we're likely to get. Last few. Okay, that's everyone. So if I close the poll and then just show you those results with you. So there you go, Ruth.
Brilliant, thanks, Phil. So it's interesting to see that so 64% training at the office, and this is certainly typical of our experience, that businesses, organisations recognise the importance of training, but actually often that training does take place at the office for very good reasons. In terms of time and budget, it's often cheaper, it's easier to get people away from their desk into training for a couple of hours. But what we often find is that when people are being trained at the office, their ability to switch off from the challenges that they were facing when they were at their desk, or the emails that were coming in, is much more limited than if they were away from the office. So it's great to see that 50% of people are saying that they're going to an external venue. So there is that sort of step towards disconnection, although obviously at an external venue, there is often still an opportunity to be in touch by email, telephone, etc. And then 36% online. So interested to see that nobody here on the webinar does use the outdoors or any other method for delivering training. So it'll be interesting to see as we go on what questions might come up around the different kinds of environment that we can deliver training in. So moving on to introduce Pedro. So Pedro, welcome to the webinar and thank you very much for joining us. I wonder Could you start off by sharing with our audience why you chose to come to Morocco with us and what your objectives for the expedition were?
Sure, Ruth, and good afternoon, everyone. Look, I'll be very honest. I actually think I was one of the few that was a bit skeptical about this whole thing of the environment having an impact on how we learn. But being close to my 40s and looking back at the past 15 years of my lifestyle, and it has been kind of a crazy race, living in close to 9 countries and working for different companies and always trying to go faster and faster and faster. I did came to a point where I thought I was getting it totally wrong in affecting my work-life balance, all the rest of it. And it was very clear to me that I had to find an opportunity to disconnect and reflect. And when I came across this opportunity, I grabbed it right away. That bit of skepticism was still there, but my will was enormous, right? So I wanted to go and give it a try and see if I could disconnect, because in my both personal and professional life, my own bad, I have not been able to carve out time and find ways to fully disconnect from the worries of the day-to-day life. And therefore, I thought I wasn't in my best, right, to do the right level of thinking and reflection. And therefore, that was my number 2 goal. I'd take a few topics, and I think it took about 3 topics that were really important to me, to Morocco, that I wanted to reflect about and work them out, think them through with both the colleagues of the expedition, which I think was a tremendous added value, just the level of the people, senior executives from different companies, and also think them through with the help of the executive coaches like you, Ruth, and Neil.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pedro. And just kind of thinking about the impact of the environment, now that you've had time to reflect, how much of a part for you did the environment play in terms of your learning?
Looking back, I think a lot, right? I don't think I could get the same out of that experience in a different environment, right? Especially if I think I would be in a classroom, and I totally underestimated that impact. I think, in a way, being close to Mother Nature makes us, play our best game. It feels great, right? Thoughts are more fluid and clear, almost like a fish in the water, and therefore, we just calm down. We have to put into consideration that the expedition, we haven't mentioned it, but was 7 days, right? In an environment where we had no network coverage for most of the duration, where we saw very, very few people. And therefore, it took me perhaps 1-2 days to fully achieve the first goal, which was to fully disconnect, right? And then, the views, the landscapes were just were fantastic, right? And therefore, the room for reflection just it's just there, and it comes natural. Obviously, our brains don't stop. We keep on thinking, but I think we think in a different way, and the environment, the natural environment, just gives us that possibility in a way that I think we can't get in other environments.
Yeah, and in terms of your feelings, your emotions at the end of that experience, did you notice how you felt at the end of Morocco?
I felt fantastic, Ruth. I felt really good because, as I said, right, I was a bit skeptical in the beginning, and I did. We're all different, and we all have different work-life balances and hobbies. And in my particular case, even in the few hobbies that I have, they have not allowed me to fully disconnect, right? And it was for the first time for a very long time that I felt, for 7 days I did disconnect, and I have not done this since my teens, when I actually played football quite seriously. And obviously, if you're on the football pitch, you can't think about anything else but the game that is taking place. And in my case, it was a source of a lot of joy and energy. And they never tracked, right? They never hiked in my life, and I can clearly see, while doing something like playing football does allow us to disconnect us. Going on an expedition of this sort, close to Mother Nature, as I said, it takes it to a different level, Ruth. So I felt recharged, right? I felt peace of mind. I was really happy because I did work on topics that were really important to me, and that were just a source of worry. And that I had not been able to work them out and make some resolutions and concrete action plans. So that peace of mind felt extremely good.
Great. And just thinking about the audience who are listening to us today, about the impact of environment, has this experience made you consider how you might approach delivering training or coaching yourself in terms of where?
Yes, I think the answer to that is certainly yes. Now, there's one thing I started doing already, which is not training related, but I travel a lot across Europe, and I have done lots of meetings with people, one-on-ones, and one of the resolutions was to try to take people out of the office, even if it's for a one-on-one chat and just walking outside. I organize annual conferences inside Nielsen, where I bring people together, and certainly I will consider the environment and the place, right, where these things take place. Because after seeing it, it's very clear to me. And it's a lot easier, as I think Paul demonstrated and you mentioned, to just do something in an hotel room or in the office of the company. But perhaps it doesn't take a lot more to have that variable into consideration, and therefore play with it for a better result.
Makes sense. And interestingly, actually, if we look at the attention restoration theory that I mentioned a moment ago, actually, if you take people out into an urban environment, the research shows that doesn't have any positive impact on those direct attention side of the brain. Whereas if you take people into the more rural, natural environment, it always does have that positive impact. So even people who don't want to actually deliver training in an outdoor setting, it can be really useful to think about a venue which has got nice views, nice grounds for people to just go out into and soak up some of that environment whilst they're learning, reflecting, talking, because it will have such a positive impact on the way their brains are functioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a lot of sense.
So one of the things that you've mentioned and has come up for us a lot has been around reflection, and the fact that actually, if we think about the environment that we learn in, reflection is key to that, because the environment needs to be conducive to people being able to reflect. And on the slide on the screen at the moment, this is a particular model that we've used, and I'm being told by my colleague that perhaps the slide is a bit distorted. Pedro, Neil, is your slide showing correctly?
No, interesting. I can only see about a quarter of the diagram. I think it must be something to do with the way your PowerPoint's coming up, Ruth.
Okay, let's just see if I restart the PowerPoint, whether that helps at all. Does that know any better? No. Okay. No. I'm going to talk about reflection then, and I apologise for those of you who are watching if you can't see the full slide. I'm not quite sure why that is happening. But essentially, during our experience of working with leaders and in businesses, and particularly looking at reflection, we've learned a lot about reflection around the reading we've done, but also from the feedback that we've received. And what we know is that for leaders who have the time to reflect, it has huge benefits for them. So reflection we see as being something that can be done about ourselves. So that internal experience of what's going on for me, how am I feeling, what are my responses, behaviours, values, biases. So really thinking about ourselves. We can then also look at the external environment, so looking at how we're interacting with other people, what's going on around us, and what that might mean for us in terms of us as leaders or how we're behaving and interacting. The relationship element of reflection, so focusing on specific relationships that may or may not be working well, and then also the systemic aspect of reflection, so thinking about what's going on in the systems that we operate in, and where the system may be blocking things, where the system may be helping or hindering ways of working. So reflection is really very valuable in each of those different areas. And what that then gives us by reflecting, it creates a suspension of action. So it allows us to stop and think. And from that, all manner of different things come. So increased choices. So that opportunity to stop and think gives us that chance to stop and reflect on what's the best choice here. Are there other choices that I've not thought of? Because when we're in action, sometimes we fail to see the different choices that are available to us. It also allows us to notice things which we may not have noticed otherwise. Spontaneity, when we stop and reflect, that kind of lifting of pressure of action allows us to suddenly find that spontaneity again, be more creative. It gives us increased emotional awareness, greater openness to different ideas and thoughts, new insights. It gives us space, and what we find for a lot of leaders is that they really crave space because they're so bombarded with meetings, deadlines, things to do, emails, that actually being able to stop and have that space is really important. So reflection delivers a lot of benefits for everybody, and it's about then finding that way of that discipline to be able to create that space for reflection. And it's something that we explored in Morocco, both reflection as a principle and some tools for reflection. So I'd like to ask Pedro a few questions about reflection and how he felt the environment helped with that reflective process. So Pedro, what did you learn about reflection in Morocco?
Well, I think I learned a lot. I think this was truly revolutionary for me in the sense that, as I was saying earlier, I totally underestimated the impact that being detached from our daily personal and professional lives in an environment that is a natural environment can have on us, right? And therefore the impact that has on our ability to reflect better, right? So I think what we discussed as being reflective learning, it was one of the key themes of the expedition and one of the key goals of the many that were there. Well, not the many, the few. It was a very exclusive group of people, but I kind of distinguished that from the what I call the washing machine thinking, right? We can, on a daily basis, we think about a lot of things, right? And we worry a lot as well. And by thinking so much, we don't necessarily solve the problems that we have. And so being in an environment like that and being able to think things through in a reflective way is really powerful because as we think them through, we also go through an exercise of almost like offloading the truck, right? Offloading our worries and creating oxygen and clarity of mind to solve some of those challenges. And a very important element, I think, in the expedition, at least to me, was combining that with the coaching that was available to us, the professional coaching, but also the coaching of the other senior executives that were in the expedition. So I think that combination of being able to reflect and having the support of a coach, and I would say You know, in today's world, being a senior leader is can be quite lonely as a job and as a mission. So having a coach is something that I certainly recommend to anyone in such a position, and it's you know, as I was saying, that combination I think is a very powerful one, and that we can apply, I think, to many people, right, in different organizations.
Something we find, Pedro, actually, is that when we're working with people, with leaders about a specific issue, and asking them to reflect, if they're in the environment where that issue exists, it's often quite difficult for them to move beyond that. They tend to get a bit stuck. So actually taking them into a different environment is a really powerful way of helping them to kind of have a different perspective and think more reflectively about that.
Absolutely. And Ruth, I think, you know, another reason, which is, you know, it's going to sound obvious, is that in our day-to-day environment, what tends to happen is that the urgent takes over the important stuff, right? And you know, an expedition or you know, of this sort allows us to go to a different environment where the urgent is not there, right? And therefore, we focus on the important. And that's why, in my case, I felt so good about it, right? Coming back to my normal life. In a better place, right? Because I did tackle those things that were important to me, and I was eager actually to go and get them done, get them rolling. And that happened because the urgent wasn't part of my life for 7 days.
So, what, building on that, then, what value have you seen so far from being more reflective? Do you think?
You know, as I said, I'm enjoying the kind of the plans that I put together while I was on the expedition, right? So that I think one of the things that motivates people the most is the feeling of accomplishing things, right? And obviously, we can only accomplish things when we know what we need to do to go and accomplish them. And very often we worry about things, but we don't define the plans, the actions that will allow us to get where we want to get. And I do remember something that we talked, and it was a revelation to me. And it was about reflective writing. And, you know, different people will have different ways of learning and reflecting. I think there's actually an interesting article, you know, by Peter Drucker that talks about how we learn as people, and I think there's 3 categories of people: those that learn while reading or listening to someone, those that learn best when they speak, and those that learn best when they write. So I did practice while I was on the expedition reflective writing, and the reason I didn't try that technique was, you know, first of all, I think it was Neil that did share that to me as something that works with many people, and then I just related to my youth, right? I do remember that I used to write a lot, and that was something that I took a lot of pleasure from, but obviously since I started my career, the only thing that I write is emails, pretty much. And for 15 years or so was the first time that I actually, you know, picked a pen and a notepad and started writing away about the topics that were, you know, challenging me and were important to me. So I definitely take that with me. It was a revelation, in the sense that I know I should not stop doing it because it works for me, and if, you know, just writing 30 minutes on a topic that is important and looking back at those 30 minutes of writing was quite something, right? So I know I can do it, and I can bring it to my daily life, and start carving out time of my week to actually, you know, close myself with a pen and paper and work out things that are important to me. So that I will definitely take with me as a technique within the overall team of reflective learning. The way I'm going to do it in practice in a very specific way, actionable way, is through reflective writing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pedro. And this might be a good moment actually just to run our second poll, which is about reflective learning. Neil, could we start that second poll?
Mm-hmm. So people can click away on the radio buttons and we'll just see what results we get back. Nearly there, a couple more people. I think that's all we're going to get.
Great.
Right, okay, I've just closed that there and share those results.
So some really interesting results there, 58% saying not great, and that doesn't surprise me because we find certainly in all the work that we do that that's one of the things that leaders really struggle to do. Yet, as you've heard so far from Pedro and from our experience, we know that that's one of the most powerful things that leaders can do in terms of their own development and giving themselves clarity and focus. Good to see that we've got some people there who are saying brilliant and okay. And I think it's always interesting to learn from people who are great at that reflective side of things, what they're doing, how they're creating that space for themselves in a world which is no doubt full of demands and challenges. So thanks, Neil. That's been useful. I'm just going to move on now to actually talking about one of the indirect impacts of the environment that we discovered from our research on Morocco and on some of the other programs which have included some kind of outdoor experience that we run. And what we've noticed is, and first of all, fantastic photograph there of our campsite in Morocco one night. So you can see we really were out in the middle of nowhere. But one of the things that we've learned is that if we can create the kind of environment where people feel that they're able to disconnect and therefore are able to reflect, that leads to greater openness and vulnerability. And there's some real power in leaders being willing to be open and vulnerable, which we're going to go on to talk about. And also coaching in that kind of environment where people are disconnected and are able to be open and vulnerable does mean that they are able to start looking at their own resilience and building resilience as a leader, which, as we all know, is so important. So we're just going to touch upon those two subjects next, just to find out a little bit more about Pedro's view and also a bit of the science behind that. So focusing first on openness and vulnerability, Pedro, I guess the starting point for me is how easy is it for people, you're a senior leader, how easy is it for people to be open and vulnerable in business, do you feel?
I think it's not easy, right? Even though we are, as human beings, social animals, and therefore we should think being open and showing some vulnerability is something that should come natural to us. The reality is that it doesn't, right? And if it is difficult on the personal side, I would say for the majority of us is even more difficult on the professional side. But it is critical, right? I think it is critical because the ability of one being open is really the essence of trust, right? That's what creates trust. With our friends, we share what's going on in our lives, and it's a two-way street, and therefore we have trust in our friends. And I don't think it's any different in the professional life. That ability to be open, to build trust, to develop good relationships is what allows us to collaborate at the workplace and do great things together, right? So to your question, Ruth, I think it is extremely important, but it's something that it does not come natural to us.
No, I agree, and I think it's something that we certainly come across. And I know that all of the delegates who came to Morocco, we asked you to watch some TED Talks, and one of the TED Talks was by Brené Brown about vulnerability, and she was saying that she often gets invited to speak in businesses, but they want her to talk about innovation and creativity and change, and that what she always says to them is that the starting point for innovation, creativity and change is vulnerability. So I think it's so important, isn't it? But so difficult to do. So what do you think? Perhaps a big question, but what do you think needs to happen in a business for people to have the confidence to be vulnerable?
Well, I think I would somehow distinguish between being open and vulnerable, and I hope this makes sense. But I'll just give an example of the reality in my company, Ruth, and to everyone. At Nielsen, being open is one of our core values, right? So in a way, I think we've got a culture that fosters people being open. It feels great. And I think that's the first stage. But being open and vulnerable may not be perceived in the same way. And for me, it was kind of another breakthrough while I was in the expedition and the things that we discussed around being vulnerable. Because being vulnerable for most people may be perceived as a weakness, right? And I think the interesting thing is that is not necessarily a weakness, right? As leaders, sometimes there is the perception that we got to know where we go, we got to show confidence and in control, and as actually human beings, we are raised like that by our parents. Trust yourself, be confident, be tough, and I think it's even more extreme in the work environment. But I think one of the reasons why we talk so much about, or people talk so much about being leaders being more authentic, right? Authentic leadership is because employee engagement is it's at a record low level, right? People are disengaged with their companies and very disengaged with their leaders. They don't trust them. And I think the reason is that they don't believe them anymore, right? Because they are not open and they're not vulnerable in the sense that when they don't know the solution for a problem, they may not come as often as they should, down to the organization, for the lack of a better expression, but basically say, I don't know where to go, right? Or I've got a challenge, can you help? And I think when leaders do that more often, that is actually perceived not as a weakness, but as a strength. Mm. And getting that balance right is difficult. So I don't have a very clear answer to you, Ruth, in terms of what companies need to do to value or practice openness and vulnerability. But I think, first of all, they need to acknowledge. So acknowledging in a company like Nielsen that being open is important. Mm. We don't need it because we're already there, right? It's part of our performance evaluation. Every time we talk about performance, we ask how people are doing on our values, not only on specific KPIs. But if a company is not there yet, I think it needs to start nurturing a culture where people can be themselves and be open, and also nurturing a culture where leaders can show vulnerability, because that will foster better collaboration, better engagement, more trust, and therefore all of the great things that all of us want, which is creativity, innovation, better products, faster growth, and so on and so forth. Mm. So I think acknowledging it is really important, and then embedding it in the culture of the company. Somehow things like this obviously make it very easy, and I incentivize companies obviously to talk about this topic, right, and send leaders on expeditions like the one we have been privileged to attend.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. And so for the benefit of the audience who are listening to us today, if we're thinking about how they can encourage their people, their leaders, to embrace vulnerability and openness, what impact do you think this kind of experience and this environment had on increasing those levels of vulnerability and openness?
I think that's a tough one, but I think I'll give a twofold answer. One is obviously detaching the person from the day-to-day environment, as we discussed, right? And I think you can do that, many ways. And I think it will always incentivize, will do some good, right, in terms of people interacting better and building some trust and kind of team building type of activities. All of that helps. But this is unique in the sense that it takes people to a natural environment, and it takes them for a long period or a reasonable period of time. In my case, and therefore you can't just be quiet all the time, just reflecting. I think then our more human side just comes to the surface and becomes so salient in an environment that is very salient as well and very powerful. So it becomes very natural that people become more open with each other and discuss what's going on in their minds. And ultimately, what I found is among the leaders that were in Morocco, we all have a lot in common in terms of both professional and in some cases personal challenges. So I think that combination of taking someone out of the day-to-day environment and then for a significant amount of time does, I think in itself, make people more open and willing to share and willing to collaborate and help each other out. I did it in my case with leaders from other organizations, so I was the only person from Nielsen. And one may say, well, it's easier for people that don't know you, don't work with you in your company, kind of to show what your problems are and challenges. It's kind of a safer environment. I would argue that I'd love to do that with Nielsen people, right? And take our senior executive team on a thing like this, because I think the impact would be exactly the same. It could take one more day for people to open up, but really, without that urgent stuff being there, then people start talking about the important stuff, and build trust and relationships, and I think that you carry with you, right, going back to the office in a way. Does that make sense, Ruth?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think moving on to the next slide, one of the things that we talked about, Pedro, you and I went and presented at the Nielsen's European Leadership Forum about the impact of this expedition for you and what leadership lessons you could share. And something we talked a lot about was resilience. So where we're in an environment where people have the space and time to reflect, they then are able to become more open and vulnerable. And we can then start looking at resilience. And the slide on your screen here is just sort of shows a little bit about the old brain. So for those of you who are listening, you'll know that the old brain and the new brain have very different functions. So the old brain is very much focused on the kind of fight, flight, freeze, that kind of response to danger or threat. And the new brain is much more to do with imagining, thinking, reasoning. So what we find sometimes is those two brains, their interactions don't always complement each other. Where we are facing some kind of threat, the old brain has that kind of emotional response to it, and the new brain, through thinking, imagining, reasoning, can kind of create complication and keep us in a loop where we stay in that threatened state. And what we see in an environment, by taking people out into an environment which is challenging, quite often they will experience these three different areas that are on the screen in front of you. So that, first of all, at the bottom, the threat-focused part of the brain, where they perceive a threat, the chemicals such as cortisol will start being generated, and actually what impact does that have on them as leaders? And we can then start to explore, well, how often do people spend time feeling threatened in the corporate world, and what are the things they can do to help themselves in terms of coming back into that safer brain. So to the top right there, the area of the brain which is more about safeness, contentment, kindness. So how can we help leaders to get into that space when they need to, if they are feeling threatened at work, so that they can then start to be productive and think more clearly again. And then over on the top left-hand side, the area which is drive, excitement, vitality. This is the area where anyone is going to be most productive. But how can we get leaders into that part of the brain so that they're functioning really well and in an optimal way, and the right chemicals are being generated which support that drive and excitement. And so by taking people out into this expedition environment, it allows us to explore these different parts of the brain, these different motivations, if you like, and how they can then start to manage their own state when they need to move from threatened brain to safe brain, for example, or to move from safe brain to the kind of more forward thinking, the drive side of the brain. And something that we talked about a lot was compassion. And one of the keys to leaders, to people moving from that threatened brain into the safe brain, was around developing the ability to be compassionate with themselves. And so, Pedro, from your point of view, we explored compassion a lot whilst we were out in Morocco. Anything for you that sort of stood out as something that you've really learned or taken back to work with you?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think together with vulnerability, compassion was something that I didn't think about before, and certainly not in a professional setting. And I think we all have challenges at work and areas that we need to work on, and both challenges or development opportunities I think are things that stress give us stress, right, and put us on that kind of threat state that you described, Ruth. And one of the takeaways from the theory around compassion is that I took with me is that we can't be good at everything, right? And we don't control everything. Therefore, it seems obvious, right? But if we focus on the things that we are better at, and acknowledge the fact, accept the fact that we just can't be good at everything, right? It's kind of saying, I know where I'm good at, and I'm enough. Using your words, Ruth, it's a huge relief, right? And so I started thinking differently about that, and that different angle, that different perspective, just takes a lot of pressure off one's shoulders. Just to share, one of the things that gives me a lot of stress is that I'm a perfectionist by nature, and have always been. And so as you get more senior and you have more responsibility and people to manage, it's a bad thing, right? So obviously, I have that awareness, and I know I can't show that I'm a perfectionist, with people that report directly to me. Otherwise, I may take power from them, or not create the best of the environments. And therefore, that's something that gives me a lot of stress, and I think puts me on the threat state, because I'm anxious about the quality of the work that is not being performed by me. But this is just another example, one example. There's many things that put us in that state that gives us stress, and I think, Ruth, I'm trying to be more compassionate with myself, right, and understanding what I think I'm better at, where I should focus on, and the things that I'm not so good. And by the way, that's a great opportunity for us as leaders to tap into the team and give an opportunity to those that are much better than we are on those things that are important for the team or the organization. So it's a new way of managing my expectations, having that compassion element in the way that I approach problems and my professional life.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pedro. I'm just going to move on before we conclude and see if there are any questions, just to talk about sort of summarising, what are the results from this experience for us? So in having decided to take a group of leaders to Morocco, what do we now see as the kind of key takeaways that we can share with you? And I think what we've noticed first and foremost, I mean, we've been talking about some words which some people may feel are kind of quite soft, vulnerability, compassion, openness, but actually the results that they deliver are far from soft. So all of the leaders who came with us to Morocco have come back saying that they've got a much greater sense of clarity, they're feeling more able to make decisions, and a really increased awareness of self and how they're responding when they're in that kind of safe space versus the threatened space, and what that might mean for them as leaders. We're also seeing leaders who come back having worked through some of their leadership issues with a coach in a safe environment, and importantly have reached some resolutions so that they're able to step back into their roles as leaders in the business with clarity, with an understanding of what resolutions they've reached and what they need to do differently. And I think a key thing then about the environment and that environment that's created with a group who take part in this kind of experience is they've had an opportunity to share knowledge, ideas, challenges, seek support from each other, and really have conversations that they don't normally have time to have, and kind of find ways through challenges by having those conversations. So before we sort of move on to the final part of the webinar, where we open this up to questions from the audience, Pedro, just a quick question for you. What do you think is the business impact or value of this kind of experience?
Well, I think it's in our case, talking about Nielsen, is the unfortunate thing is that it was only one person from Nielsen going, right? And what I'm trying to do is obviously leverage that, for myself, but also sharing with the rest of the organization. And you have experienced that, Ruth, because we have invited you to come and talk at the Nielsen European Leadership Forum, where we explore some of these concepts. But I think you kind of said it all, right? I think the impact is huge, right? Talk about employee engagement, as I mentioned earlier. That's a huge problem, particularly in Western Europe, where the economic environment is so tough, right? And companies have to go through a lot of restructuring processes and all the rest of it. And so it's not easy, and there is lack of trust in the leaders. Every new leader, and that usually happens rather often these days, where you have a new leader or a new CEO every 2 years or 3 years, depending where you are, but comes with different ideas, with a different positioning, and many employees are just don't trust it any longer, right? Don't trust people have a clear strategy, that they are consistent, and so on and so forth. And therefore, and the leaders themselves are extremely stressed, right? They don't know what to deal with this. So I think the business impact is huge, right? If leaders have the time to think about what's important versus what's urgent, right, and are able to carve that out, they will benefit themselves and their organizations hugely, right? And if they can create a culture where the entire organization is more open in the relationships that there are in the culture, that being vulnerable is something that is accepted, and that's okay. I think they will all be we would all be in a much better place. I think one of the latest polls, Ruth, I think it's a global employee survey, was quoted early in the year in the Harvard Business Review. I recall that, talked about employee engagement being at 13%, so meaning 13% of the workforce, and that's a global survey with hundreds of thousands of employees, are actively engaged with their organizations, and 18% only trust their leader. So we're talking about figures that are very, very low. So anything we can do, and certainly this would be a huge contribution to create trust in organizations, can have a massive impact. So that's kind of how I see it, to be honest.
Great, thanks, Pedro. So just a couple of conclusions then. What we've learnt, and building upon our experience in the past, is that environment is critical to people's learning. So if you are delivering training, think about where, not just what you're delivering. That reflection, as you've heard from Pedro, is vital in every business. So how can you encourage your leaders to make space for it? And that openness, vulnerability and compassion are the route into innovation, creativity and change. So actually encouraging that, supporting it, helping your leaders to role model that in the business is critical. I'm conscious of time, so what I'm going to do is just hand over to Neil quickly to see if there are any questions that have come in that you feel haven't been covered in our discussions. So Neil, over to you.
There's sort of one area that, I mean, you've touched on it briefly, but there's a few questions that I'll try and paraphrase into one that cover the same theme, which is around, you've both been talking a lot about the experience in Morocco. People asking, well, how possible is it to create that same sort of experience closer to home at a much lower cost?
I'm sure, Pedro, you'll have your view on this. I might just quickly say from my point of view, I mean, we work with businesses where we take people on outdoor experiences in the UK as well as overseas. And I think from our point of view, any opportunity to take people out of the work environment into a more creative and inspirational environment has a significantly greater impact in terms of learning. And understandably, not all organisations will be able to invest in a kind of a week away for their senior team to Morocco. Those that can, that's where the greatest impact is going to be. But actually thinking about how you can do that in a shorter way somewhere closer to home will equally show significant impact in comparison to being in a classroom. Pedro, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think I agree, Ruth. I think the cost is really, it's not the problem, right? I think maybe time would be perceived a little bit more as a challenge. But actually, if you think, the one we've done was 7 days, but, basically you lose 5 working days, but we don't lose, right? The payoff of this thing is huge. Now, replicating this in different environments, in my view, I agree with you, Ruth, but I would say anything you can do outdoors will certainly help. But a great benefit of this expedition is actually the duration, right? So I would think that anything, the first couple of days is just, and very few, I don't know how many companies do a couple of days outdoors, but I think it would be great. But if you go beyond the couple of days, then the benefits, I think, are not compared, because it allows people to really disconnect. And guess what? You are in the middle of nowhere, but by the way, fantastic views and landscapes, surrounded by a group of people. And the tendency, the natural thing to do is to be open, to build relationships with those people, and you know why you're there, right? You're all there to think about things that are important, and therefore all of the rest kind of comes natural. So Neil, to your question, yes, I think it can be done differently, but I would incentivize in a big way companies to give it a try at least, because I think the payoff is huge. So it doesn't become a matter of cost any longer, because the return is very significant.
Great, thanks, Pedro. Neil, were there any other questions that you wanted to fit in before we finish?
There was one more. Again, it's from a couple of people. It was just around, we've talked about on these experiences taking people out of their comfort zone, and how easy it is to develop these programs in the outdoors and natural environments without them being over challenging when you've got a broad spectrum of people in an organisation.
I think the key is about it's about using the outdoors as a sort of safe space for reflection and discussion, as opposed to creating something which is going to push people physically in a way that actually they're not going to learn from. So, of course, on an expedition to Morocco, some people will be more comfortable in that environment than others, but actually we deliberately are setting it up so that it's a supportive environment where we're able to give that necessary level of encouragement and support to those people who might be feeling a bit more stretched than others. And I think there's an opportunity where people are feeling stretched, going back to that kind of the old brain, new brain side of things that we were talking about, actually helping people to understand what does go on for them in terms of when they're in threatened brain and what they can do to be compassionate to themselves and manage that state. But I think the key is really not designing something which is just going to put people into that fear and threatened space straight away, because they won't learn. Mm-hmm. I'm just conscious of time, and that we said we would finish at 5. So I just wanted to flash up on the next screen some reading for anybody who's interested in doing any more reading around this topic. And there's some really fascinating stuff out there about environment, about reflection, and how nature can influence the way our brains work and operate. And so please do have a look at those if you're interested. And what we're going to do with the post-webinar questionnaire, there's going to be a question in there to ask you whether you'd like us to send that to you as a PDF reading list. So if you would like that, please do answer our questionnaire and just indicate that you would like us to send that through. We're also going to send through some links to some videos that we filmed when we were in Morocco with Pedro, just to give you a flavour of some of the conversations we were having whilst we were out there. We've not been able to share those on the webinar because the broadband wouldn't cope with that level of data travelling. So we'll send those links through to you. But I think from our point of view, thank you very much for logging on and listening. I hope you found it helpful to think a little bit about the environment that you deliver training in, and how you can be more imaginative about that, and some of the real benefits that come from getting out of the classroom and doing things a bit differently. Pedro, any final reflections from you before we say goodbye?
No, I think there's just maybe one, Ruth, really quick, which is around vulnerability. We discussed that at Nielsen, and I think being open and vulnerable is something that is within the control of the leader, right? So leaders always are in charge of deciding when and how they're going to be open and vulnerable. And I think the key is not being open and vulnerable about everything all the time, but is taking that into consideration, right, and making sure that they are doing that. So perhaps something I didn't mention, but I found quite important.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, Pedro, thank you very much for sharing your insights and experiences about how that Morocco experience for you has impacted on your leadership style, approach, and really appreciate the time you've given. And thank you also to the people who have been listening today. And please do get in touch if you've got any further questions that you feel haven't been covered. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.